Hi, my name is Paul and I'm an aspiring sound designer. The sounds of a game play a huge role in every game's experience, whether setting a certain mood, building immersion, or giving audio cues to a professional esports gamer who uses the audio cues to make split-second decisions in-game. What I find particularly interesting about game audio is how every player is going to have a different experience whenever they play the game, whereas in films, the audio is set to trigger at specific times, which is called linear versus non-linear media. Today I want to discuss the methods used to create the sounds for Super Mario 64. I chose this game because I'm a huge Nintendo fan, and I can't help but to notice how animated and interesting the sounds are in this game. But first we have to rewind a little bit. The year was 1994, and Nintendo had just given sound designer Yoji Inagaki the role of making all the sounds for Super Mario 64. Keep in mind, the Nintendo 64 was the first Nintendo console capable of holding actual audio samples, unlike the prior consoles, which consisted mostly of oscillator tones. This was a huge task for Inagaki, since, on average, a single game for the N64 required hundreds upon hundreds of sounds, and he was only one man. Nowadays, game studios have teams of designers working together to create the sounds for a game. He was given an impossible task. Well, not completely impossible. Thankfully for him, a big part of his job had already been done. Back then, just like how video games were evolving to feel more new and polished, so were films. Films were moving away from strictly using sound effects, and now were more focused on realism and actual voice acting. Well, all these sounds were kept on file, stored on CDs available for anyone to purchase, and that brings us back to Inagaki. Inagaki used several of those sound libraries to bring his vision of the sounds of Mario 64 to life. One of a sound designer's most important jobs is to take creative approaches to sounds and think outside of the box. Take for example the sound of a car alarm. What if I told you this exact sound was used for this penguin's footsteps? I bet if you've played this game before you would have never noticed this. Also, if this sample sounds familiar to you, that's probably because it was used in over 15 different TV shows, movies, and commercials, including Cars, The Fairly Odd Parents, SpongeBob SquarePants, and even a Toyota commercial.
Think of, do you understand? No.
This is a common theme throughout most of the sound effects in Mario 64. Another interesting sound effect is from a sound effect library called Voice Spectral Volume 1. Can you guess what Mario character uses this sound? If you guessed Koopa Troopa, you would be correct. This sample was used more as a source of audio to manipulate, rather than a full audio clip. You can make the iconic Koopa Troopa sound by taking only the beginning of the sample and fading out and duplicating it. Then reverse that and run it through a resonant bandpass with an envelope follower. If you don't know what an envelope follower is, it's basically a way to control another parameter using the same envelope shape as the source audio, kind of like an LFO. At first, when trying to design this sound, I had no idea what to do. But thanks to the sound design Discord community, I was given advice on how I should approach the sound. I'll make sure to link their Discord server below. If you're a beginner to sound design like me, I highly recommend joining, as there are several industry professionals who are active and happy to give advice. Here's my rough attempt at recreating this sound. Variations of this audio sample were later on used for pretty much all games including Koopa Troopa in the series. Finally, before I go on to actually creating some sounds, I want to touch on one more thing. Although the N64 was revolutionary for its 3D graphics and actual audio samples, it was still limited on space. Because of this, developers really had to make the most out of game cartridges' space, so they would often reuse sounds playing them back slower or faster. The most famous example of this is Bowser's evil laugh. His laugh is actually the same sound that the boos make, just sped up. Ironically, the person who is laughing in this recording is Charles Martinet, who voiced Mario, but it was recorded several years before the development of Mario 64 even started. So I guess that confirms when Bowser laughs at Mario, Martinet is actually laughing at himself. Well, now we have learned that a lot of the sounds were not actually synthesized for the sole purpose of the game, but all of them were manipulated in some way in order to give them character and fit into the world of Mario 64. Here's a 2-minute clip I recorded of random gameplay. Listen carefully to the details of every sound that's being played. After it's done playing, I'm going to take you through my work process of how I will be remaking these sounds, and I'll show you how I made them work together and fit into the setting.
Let's go.
I'm going to try my best to keep this simple and not throw a ton of information at you all at once. I also want to preface this by saying I'm still very much a beginner and don't really have any idea what I'm doing. I just really like making sounds. There are 5 effects that I use pretty much exclusively when making these sounds: compression, frequency shifter, overdrive, EQ, and delay. Compression. If you don't know what a compressor does, in simplest terms, it takes the loudest parts of an audio signal and makes them quieter, and takes the quietest parts of an audio signal and makes them louder, basically reducing the dynamic range. There are hundreds of different compressors out there, which all have different sound algorithms. A couple of my favorites are OTT and the Ableton stock glue compressor. OTT has become a giant meme within music producers for literally translating to over-the-top compression, but it is actually a really great tool to have, as it can make really dull sounds sound more detailed and alive.
That's my vibe. That's my vibe.
Glue compressor is a great all-around compressor that is super simple to control and great for gluing several elements together. The N64 utilizes compression on every sound, as it is a technique used to get rid of non-critical data and save storage space. This is due to reducing the dynamic range. Frequency shifter. There are so many different ways to manipulate a sound with this plugin. If you're wondering how a frequency shifter works, it takes all of the frequencies and shifts them to the right or the left of the spectrum. This can result in some very interesting tones and is a good way to add variety to a sound. Also, if you've ever wondered how this sound is made, it's made by reducing the dry-wet of a frequency-shifted signal, giving it this weird phasey sound. Overdrive. Not to be confused with saturation, Ableton's overdrive is a great way to add missing frequencies to a sound, kind of like erosion or noise. For example, if a sound is lacking low end, you can bring it back with an overdrive. EQ. Equalizers are a tool to adjust the volume levels of certain frequencies of a sound. If you don't know what an EQ is, I bet you have used one before, as they are a common feature in cars and home stereos. Generally, I use EQs to make space in a mix. It's important that low frequencies don't overlap. This can result in a muddy mix. I usually create a mono group dedicated to frequencies below 150 Hz, so I can keep the sub-frequencies as clean as possible. All of the sounds used in the N64 are lacking frequencies above 10K. This is likely due to saving storage space. Delay. Delay is an effect that plays back an input signal for a certain amount of time. This is widely referred to as an echo. You can also affect the amount of time in between a delayed signal, and you can produce some interesting tonal qualities when set to short values. Interestingly, pretty much all of the sounds in Mario 64 had some sort of delay on them, mostly around 100 to 150 milliseconds. I think this was a method used to have all of the sounds fit together in a certain setting and add more character. Now I will go over some of the sounds I found particularly interesting. I made most of these sounds using wavetable synthesis. If you'd like to follow along, 3 really good ones are Serum, Vital, and Phase Plant, but I highly recommend Vital since it's free for some reason. The first sound that I made was this camera sound. Generally, when trying to remake a sound, the first step I do is I play the sample on loop and really try to listen to what I'm hearing. Then I plan out how I'm going to make the sound in my head, so I'm not just doing things at random. I then try to emulate the pitch using a simple saw wave. I do this by using an LFO to modulate the pitch over time. Then I mess around with the LFO until it sounds how I like. After that, you kind of need to just mess around with different wavetables until you find something similar. I found this sound was most accurate using a sine wave with some added harmonics and some sync. After I made the bass of the sound, I made it sound more full and louder with some compression and gave it some movement with the filter movement. To make this sound, I just repeated the process but changed the pitch envelope to go upwards. One of my favorite and widely overlooked features in several synthesizers is the noise oscillator. It's normally used to inject noise into sounds, but I like to use it as a sampler. In Serum, if you turn on keyboard tracking in one-shot mode, you can drag any sample in and play it at different pitches. This is really easy and a fun way to change the timbre of your sound, and can yield some very interesting results. When making the start menu sound, I decided to take this approach as I heard a very distinct melody being played in the sound. After cycling through some sounds, I landed on this bell sound. And if I take it out, you can hear a clear absence in the sound. When making this other start menu sound, I could tell that it was most likely a variation of the first sound. I could tell this sound was more percussive and atonal than the previous one, so I replaced the bell sound with a shaker and a recording of me making a sound with my mouth. These are a pretty simple sound to make. Just get some white noise, then modulate a bandpass to go up and down. You can control the speed and draw the shape you want within the LFO. I also recorded a quiet layer with my voice. And of course, like most other sounds, I added a tonal delay to give it more character. Here are a couple of whoosh sounds that I made. It took me a while of messing around in my synth to realize that this was actually a real instrument. This sound was most likely a recording of a mark tree, or better known as bell chimes. When the sample was loaded onto the N64, it made it sound more like one cohesive lo-fi sample due to compression and data loss. But in reality, the original recording probably sounded more like 25 to 35 notes sweeping upward. This was definitely my favorite sound I made. I was so proud of myself for making it sound so lifelike and realistic, like an actual recording of an animal, but in reality, I made it with a synthesizer in MIDI. I made it sound vocally by modulating the bend plus minus of a waveform. Just listen to what happens when I deactivate it. It's just not the same. If you don't know what bend plus minus is, the best way to explain this effect is just to visually show you what it does to a wavetable. There are tons of other ways to affect a wavetable in Serum, and you can even create your own variations. I came across these sounds when I was actually designing this sound. When making that sound, I was basically throwing some random samples at it and seeing what would stick. Eventually, I accidentally added a vocoder to a reversed kick drum and got this sound. To me, that sounded a lot more like a door slamming shut, so I duplicated it and started working on the doors. Both of these door samples were made just by throwing in anything from kick drums to claps to pots and pans dropping on concrete. The important thing to remember about sounds like this is the cadence of when things are being played back. For example, this sounds a lot less interesting than this. It's important to give each element space within the sound. For this, I actually went outside and recorded ambience at my local park. I ended up recording some footsteps as well, since I knew I would end up using those for later. This is one of my favorite parts about sound design. You don't have to make something in a synthesizer for a sound to be made by you. It can be as simple as recording yourself walking through the woods with an iPhone microphone, or recording a weird noise from your dishwasher and putting crazy effects on it. The pipe sounds came from a variation of this sound that plays whenever you exit a course. This is really simple and it's just a huge arpeggio with some delay and filtering. If you're a fan of the old Nintendo games, you probably realize that these sounds are very similar to the classic power-up and pipe sounds. Just now that technology was more evolving, they had more options than just a square wave for wavetables, and also had some resonant filters, which generally make things sound more complex if used correctly. Also, I guess I should mention now that the start screen sound is also a variation of the classic start menu sound. Explosion sounds are generally done in 3 different parts: the transient, the body, and the tail. I started this sound by running around my room and randomly hitting things and recorded the sounds. I then took some of the samples I thought were the most interesting and started layering them to make the transient. To make the body, I used another 2 Foley samples and pitched them down. Added a saturator to bring out some harmonics, an overdrive to bring out some highs, and a multiband compressor to balance out all of the frequencies. And finally, I repeated the process, but I added a long reverb to get the tail. Usually, I would high pass the reverb to keep it clean, but for the explosion, I like to low pass it so the low end rings out, like you're watching an explosion from a distance and can feel the impact after the initial hit. I glued them back together with some compression and EQ to get this. You can use this formula to get all kinds of explosion sounds just from a simple recording. This sound I split up in 2 different sections, an oscillator section and a percussive section. Starting with the percussive section, I recorded the sound of an air compressor in my garage because the winding up sound sounded so cool to me. I did some minor processing and layered 2 different parts of the recording together to get this. And then layered in a reverse clap sample to get this. Remember, just like when making the door sounds, it's super important to have an interesting rhythm when layering sounds like this. For the oscillator section, I split the sound into 2 sections. This static sine wave with some formant scale, and this robotic sound. You'll notice the sound kind of has a looping feel to it. This is from an LFO controlling the wavetable position. You can see if I turn the wavetable view to 3D, it's only really going through a couple different variations. I also pitched it down by 27 semitones to make it sound more atonal. This sound is that recording of my air compressor again. The only processing I did to it was frequency shifting it down, compressing, and adding some overdrive. This is what my version sounded like. I took a similar approach to the sound that I did when making the explosion sound, in the sense that I split it up into 3 different sections. I made a layer of random popping sounds I had from my sound library, added some footsteps for when Mario is landing back on the ground, and also added this noise layer for when Mario is pushing himself out of the ground. Something interesting I did with this one is I used a compressor to sidechain the noise layer to the pop, making it mute whenever the pop is playing to keep the sound clean. I also used an auto pan with the phase turned down to 0 to add some tremolo, giving the illusion Mario is struggling to pull himself up. After making all the sounds, I had to put them back into the video. First and foremost, I dropped the video clip into Ableton. This was actually my first time working with video in Ableton, and it was actually really nice to have a visual while working, although it can be buggy at times. I found that before you save, if you deactivate the clip with the 0 key, it fixes most of the issues. I started by grouping all of the sounds into categories and averaging out the levels. I then dragged everything to its correct placement and corrected any sounds that sounded out of pitch. I then added some panning to a couple things such as the Lakitu and the penguin. A lot of the footstep sounds were actually my footsteps I recorded walking on various surfaces. I found it difficult for the footsteps to work in the beginning. Then I decided to put them in a sampler so I could easily draw them out in MIDI. This made it much easier to manage. Also, it's important to keep the footsteps random, whether that be the pitch or the sample. I use kilohertz transient shaper as a kind of envelope shaper to make some of the footsteps less intense. Something kind of weird I noticed when working on the footsteps while inside the castle, it seems like the sound designer reversed some of the footsteps to add variation when you're running around indoors. It's kind of interesting how when you listen to Mario's movement for a while, it starts to make rhythms that sound really cool, especially from the swooshes when he flips and the white noise whenever he slides. It's like the game is constantly throwing a subconscious rhythm in your head, or maybe that's just me. I feel like that's part of the reason why speedruns of this game are so entertaining to watch. Now that all the sounds are in place, all that's left to do is add in some of the yahoos from Mario and give all the sounds a mix down. I also added 3 reverbs, being automated on and off at different times. I use an ambient reverb for the castle courtyard, a more roomy reverb for the inside, and a more open ambient reverb for the snow stage. It's important to keep all of the camera and menu sounds outside of the group with the reverb, as they don't necessarily live in the same world as Mario. They are more supposed to be cues for the real world. Well, without further ado, here is my recreation of the sounds from Mario 64.
Let's go.
Before I leave, I want to briefly touch on some of the music from this game, as some of the ideas are actually incredible in my opinion. But first, where did these sounds come from? The original samples were just one-shots being played at different pitches in MIDI in order to save space. You can actually download all of the sounds and play them back in your DAW with a Soundfont Player. I'll leave a download link to the Soundfont and the Soundfont Player that I use, so you can experiment for yourself. If you're interested in remixes of these songs, tons of producers actually use these samples in their music. I recommend Hyper Potion's remix of File Select. I feel like it shows how these songs could have sounded if they were made nowadays. But where did these sounds originally come from? Some people think the sounds were sampled from the Roland SC88, but it's actually more likely that they were sampled from the Yamaha DX7 or another synth trying to emulate the DX7, as it was a very popular synth used at this time period. Shifting Sandland, also known as Lethal Lava Land, is probably my favorite song from this game, as it sounds more like an improv jam rather than an actual song. There is really no time signature to it, and if you listen to the percussion in the background, it doesn't really fit perfectly in time. The lead instrument at the beginning has often been identified by fans resembling a sitar, but it actually sounds more like a bowed instrument, such as a sarangi. This song starts out with a really interesting intro solo, then breaks out into a groovy beat and a funky bass line. Something I really like about soundtracks like this is the instruments change up depending on where you are in the game. Once you go underneath the cave into the water section, a choir comes in, and the main bass patch is briefly taken out. If you listen carefully, you will notice that the song is actually a remix of the original underground song from the classic Mario Bros. Game. While on topic of this song, did you know this song was heavily inspired by another song? This is Let's Not Talk About It by Friendship, released in 1979. These songs are almost identical, but interestingly, this song sounds a lot more upbeat and closer to the remix version in Mario 64 than the classic version. This is a song you probably wouldn't think much of, but it's actually more complex than you might think. Listen to the song carefully. It sounds like the song is forever ascending higher and higher, but it never seems to come back down. But how is that possible? It's an auditory illusion called a shepherd tone. Here is an example of a shepherd tone. It consists of several tones, separated by an octave, layered on top of each other. As the tones move up the scale, the highest pitch gets quieter, the lowest pitch gets louder, and the middle pitch stays the same. Since you can always hear at least two different pitches ascending at the same time, your brain is tricked into thinking that the tone is constantly rising in pitch forever. You can test this phenomenon out for yourself using this shepherd tone generator website. And also, the Synth Vital has a shepherd tone built into the wavetable. Again, I still don't know how Vital is free. What were you thinking, Matt Title? Also, I'll make sure to leave a link to Vital as well as the shepherd tone website in the description. Well, if you made it this far into the video, thanks for listening to me awkwardly talk for so long. I've never made a video like this, and honestly just made it for fun and out of boredom. I do plan on uploading more videos showcasing some sound design work, but I probably won't make another video like this. This video was just my first dive into sound design, and it's really only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the possibilities of sound design. If you are a game developer looking for someone to design sounds, I would love to work with you. I will put a link to my website in the description where you can get in contact with me. In the meantime, you can watch some more of my sound design content right here. Thanks again for watching.